Om Vakratunga Mahakaya Surya Koti Samaprabha Nirvignam Kurume Deva Sarvakaryeshu Sarvada Saraswati Namastubhyam Varade Kamarupini Vidyarambham Karishyami Siddhir Bhavatu Me Sada Gurur Brahma Gurur Vishnu Gururdevo Maheshwaraha Guru Sakshat Param Brahma Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Punatto Sahaviryam Karavavahe Tejasvidhavadhetamastu ma vidvishavahe Om Shanti 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 Om Shri Paramatmane Namaha
Om Shri Paramatmane Namaha.
Tata Chaturthodhyayaha
Atha Chaturthodhyayaha.
Shri Bhagavanuvacha
Shri Bhagavanuvacha.
Shloka number 80. We are still in the Shloka 80. Goes on and on because it's a cryptic Shloka. Karmanya karma yaf pashyed
Karmanya karma yah paschet.
akarmani cha karma yaha
Akarmani cha karma yaha.
sabuddhiman manushyeshu
Sabuddhiman manushyeshu.
sayukta krishna karma krita.
Sayukta Krishna karma krita.
The meaning, simple meaning to be understood. Karmani akarma yaha pashyed. In action, one who sees inaction. Atma doesn't do action, even though the person does action, no karma, because kartrutvam not there. Ahankara not there, therefore kartrutvam not there. Akarmani cha karma yas pashyed. In inaction, action. One who sees action. Even though a person is not acting, not physically acting. But Ahankara is physically doing or not doing doesn't matter. Kartrutvam is there, Ahankara is there, therefore is karta only, is doing karma. Cannot remain quiet even for a moment. So he is always doing karma. So that is what not doing is not really not doing. Not doing is also doing, provided the person is ahankara, has got ahankara, kartrutvam. Ahankara means kartrutvam. Yatra yatra ahankara, tatra tatra kartrutvam. Ekakarta sah bhukta. So the one who understands the truth, this is the truth of karma. What karma is? Buddhiman, initiation. And he is the one who has Krishna karma kriti, who has fulfilled all the desires by doing what is to be done. Because he has the knowledge of Atma. So what is to be done is done by him. Yes. In the ultimate destination, that is jnana, moksha. Then the next topic, negation by knowledge. When the truth of oneself is recognized, Atma Swarupam, Atma Tattvam, the ego doesn't go, strictly speaking. Sankara doesn't go. Ego doesn't go. Then what happens? Ego is, why should go? Let it be there because it is not real. Rather, this recognition is what makes one see the ego as Mithya. It is not Satyam. Previously, it was Satyam. If ego is hurt, the person is hurt. Ego is Mithya. It's not the ego. Ego is me, but I am not the ego. Atma is the ego is Atma, but Atma is not the ego. Therefore, ego is Mithya. He recognizes ego as Mithya, not Satyam. Before Jnanam, this Mithya ego was Satyam. Now, after Jnanam, ego is understood as it is, Mithya. Therefore, why should it go? It will be there. Now that ego will become an ornament. Ego, generally, which is represented in uh, in Puranas and in pictures of gods and goddesses as a snake. For Lord Shiva, that snake is an ornament. Snake is, he wears a snake as a necklace around his neck. The snake stands for ego. So that ego becomes an ornament. It is enlightened ego. That is why for Bhagavan it is an ornament. Not only for Bhagavan, even for a Jnani who has, who has known the truth, for him, this ego becomes an ornament. Therefore, he need not go. Doesn't go. He need not go also. Therefore, the going of the ego is only purely in terms of negation, ada, or destruction by knowledge. The word destruction is generally used in a physical sense, such as destroying an object, ashyati, adarshanam, so that it no longer exists in that form. Here, the destruction of the ego is purely in terms of negation, ada, not ego is not. Ego is negated by jnana. Ego as real, the reality given to the ego is negated. Negation by knowledge occurs when an object is there, but its reality is taken away. For example, you can enjoy the blue sky, but at the same time, knowing that the sky is not really blue, dismisses blueness. You know very well sky is not blue. Looking at the blue sky, you revel in that color. Vast sky, blue sky. You admire, but you know very well it's not blue. Really. So knowing you enjoy, therefore it doesn't hurt you. Or enjoying a movie, you can dismiss its reality. A child, on the other hand, cannot dismiss a movie as unreal because for the child, the elephant, the tigers, everything in the movie are real. The child may even cry, not knowing the objects and situations in the movie are only appearances and therefore mithya. Until the child knows it movie is mithya, the movie will remain real. This knowing comes by negation. Bhada. Just example for Bhada, it's a sky, color of the sky, blueness, blue sky. Blueness is negated. Negated only in terms of understanding, but still blueness, blue sky is there. The sky doesn't go away, the blueness doesn't go away, the blueness of the sky is still blue, but you know it is not blue. That is negation by knowledge. So therefore, knowledge comes by negation, other understanding an object or situation and removing the reality of it. Similarly, the ego is not removed. What happens to the ego? Fact is that it has no independent existence is understood. And what does the ego that everyone has depend upon? What is it that exists independently without depending on the ego upon which everything else depends? The ego depends for its existence on Atma, the self. It is not the ego. Therefore, the self is the truth of very ego. Ego is because of Atma. So Atma, in fact, Atma alone is. An ego sustained because of Atma. The ego has its existence on this Atma. Atma has its existence on nothing else. It has self-existent, self-existent. There is one truth for every ego, and everything that is done by the ego, and that truth, Satya, is called Atma or the self. Therefore, the self is the content of the ego, without which there is no ego. So one Satya Atma is not ego and is a Karta. Therefore, then who is the Karta? Ego alone is Karta. Agankara is the Karta. Agankara is Bharita, the wake of Jnanam. So, Kartratvam, Agankara not there, Karta not there. Atma is not Karta. So, it's Akartra Atma Agamiti. That is Jnana, that is knowledge. To be a Karta, you must have thought. This thought has its being in I, consciousness. Therefore, you say, I am the doer. Doership itself is a thought centered on I. I do, I read, I walk, I sleep. What is to be understood here is that while the thought is centered on I itself is not centered on thought. Thought is centered on I is not centered on thought. Recognition of this fact is not the elimination or removal of thought. It is understanding, purely understanding the truth of I. Thought exists because of I. I, existence of I, not on thought. I, the Atma is self-existent. Thoughts, they are centered on I. They are existing. The thoughts exist because of the I consciousness. Therefore, only we said thought as its being in I. The I is here, not Ahankara, capital I, consciousness. How does one know Atma? How does the ego know the Atma? How does one know Atma is that one is Ahankara, ego. Atma need not know itself because it is self-evident. It is self-effulgent, self-evident. So who must know Atma? The ego. The ego must know Atma to understand that ego, that itself is not real. Ahankara has to discover the Swarupa of itself to be Atma. So how does the ego know the Atma? You may ask. Ego generally knows everything else. But how can it know Atma? Atma not being an object of the ego. In response to this question, there are those who will say the Atma will transcend the ego and you will know. What does transcending the ego mean really? It's just a word. It doesn't, no understanding happens just by listening to the sentence. Atma will transcend the ego. How does it transcend? What does it mean? Does the ego go away? Or does it come back? Or jumps the ego and goes Atma? If the ego goes away, there is no one there. If having transcended the ego doesn't come back. Who will be there to know the Atma? So transcending the ego has not, and transcending the ego is transcended. Then who will know? Ego is not, then who will know? Who will be there to know the Atma? Then there is no Atma Jnanam. There is no moksha. For moksha also for who? If such were the case, gaining this knowledge would amount to becoming a vegetable. It just becomes a vegetating being. If the ego is transcended in order to know Atma, it is not definitely not going to come back. Therefore, who will say that I know Atma? Who will be there to know the Atma? Therefore, this explanation is not acceptable. What is the transcending means? If you transcend the ego, understand the Atma. If you transcend the ego, understand the Atma, and the ego comes back, who is it that who understood? Who is it that who understood the Atma? It is the ego that has to understand the Atma. These kinds of statements about surrendering the ego and transcending the ego in order to understand the Atma are very confusing to people. That's why we don't use all these words. Surrendering the ego. Yesterday we discussed surrendering the ego. What ego surrender means, and who will know? Then how to surrender the ego also. Transcending the ego. All these are words really doesn't really enlighten. That's what Buddhism doesn't have any meaning. So the just of words. It cannot make a person understand, comprehend what it is really. Transcending the ego. Unfortunately, they are too often to be found in the modern books on Vedanta, New Vedanta, and must therefore be seen for what they are. The means of knowledge are for the ego alone. Pramanam is only for the ego, not for the Atma. Shastra Pramanam is for the Atma. How can Atma operate Shastra Pramanam? Why should it operate? Atma knows it's Atma. So, therefore, the self-existent Atma need not know itself because it is self-existent. Therefore, no Praman need to be operated. And what is the need for Pramana? It is ego alone uses of Pramana, the means of knowledge available, including the Shastra, perception, that is Pratyaksha, Anumana, Arthapati, etc. Even Shastra Pramana, and so on. The ego, the Ahankara uses perception and analyzing the data gathered by perception, that is Pratyaksha, Anumana, gains inferential understanding also, Anumana, and Arthapati. Thus, perception and inference are in the hands of Ahankara, the ego, the Karta, the subject, all mean the same. who wielding these two instruments of knowledge perceives and influences. The means of knowledge, therefore, is always employed by a subject who is a karta, meaning the one who has meaning the one who has ego, who has ahankara, ego employs the means of knowledge. Therefore, in the employment of the means, any means of knowledge, there is subject, karta is there, and karanam is there, and action is there, kriya, and the result of action, karma pala. Whether a piece of knowledge or an action, whether a piece of knowledge or an action produces a result or not, there is always a karta behind it. Behind it, behind pramanam, behind operating the pramanam, karta is there. Behind karma, karta is there. So karta always is there. So perception and inference yielded by the ego are not going to help you know Atma, because Atma is the very essence of ego. Atma is that which is behind the ego, meaning that is the truth of the ego. Here, behind is what is behind also to be understood here. What is behind the ego? It is not space wise. The truth of ego is Atma. Atma is the truth of the ego. How then is the Atma to be known? This is where Agama Pramana, that is Shastra Pramana, revelation in the form of Shabdas, words comes in. When Shabda is a Pramana, the means of knowledge, the ego doesn't do anything. What happens is the Shabda creates a thought, everything. The words creates everything, a thought in the mind, showing that you are the Atma, that is Brahma, not the ego. The consciousness, Chaitanyam, that is Atma, which is limitless, which is Purnaha, is you. This is the teaching, Upadesha, and it removes ignorance of yourself. Ego, which mistakes the ego, which because of ego, the person mistakes himself for a limited being, that is removed. That ignorance. Ego is a cause for ignorance. Because of ignorance, ego is. Not ego. Let's say avidya is a cause. Ajnanam is a cause. The unenlightened ego is a cause. Jnana means ahankara, that is the unenlightened ego. Because of ajnana, the atma is and the atma is taken to be the ego. The truth of ego is atma. Therefore, because not knowing that, considering that ego to be real, not knowing the truth of ego is atma. Therefore, he engages in vyavahara, he does karma, therefore ahankara, kartrutvam, etc. Now the Upadesha is remove the ignorance of yourself. Ignorance is I take myself to be a limited being, that is the ego. Doership. Doership means it implies ego. Karta bhokta is this ego, ahankara. So ahankara nivritti. Therefore, ahankara is because of ajnana. Jnanam is not knowing the truth. Therefore, Upadesha is for knowing the jnanam. The jnanam of yourself. Your ignorance of yourself. Your ignorance of yourself. Language is like that. It removes your ignorance. It means ignorance, not you. Ignorance is adhyastha. Ignorance, it is superimposed. That is ajnanam, anatma, that ahankara, superimposed on atma. Therefore, you become a jiva. Therefore, your ignorance. Of whom? Of yourself. Your ignorance of yourself. So, therefore, you can remove your ignorance. You can remove your ignorance by jnana. Therefore, what are you teaching to Upadesha? Destruction of self-ignorance. Ajnanam. Self-ignorance only manifests the form of I, ahankara. So, ahankara is ajnanam, self-ignorance. A person who takes himself or herself to be the ego thinks, I am only this much. Nothing more is known about oneself than this. This ignorance, because of which the ego is there, yes. Ignorance is the cause, because of which only the ego is there. Ignorance is the root cause, not the ego is a ajnana karya. So, not the other way. Ignorance is there, because of which ego is there. So ego, ahankara is ajnana karyam, and it is destroyed by the vritti, the thought, that is the words of the Shastram, Aham Brahma Asmi. That is the knowledge which is born out of the teaching. With the destruction of this ignorance, the notion that I am the ego disappears. That is, Ajnanam disappears. Nothing more is necessary. What else is required to understand? What else is required to be free from ignorance? Only knowledge is required. Knowledge that I am the ego, that wrong, the knowledge I am the ego which is wrong, which is false, that is destroyed. When that goes away, I, the Atma, shines as it is, free of ego. Now the Atma as though has become free from the hold of ego. What happens to the ego in the wake of knowledge? The wake of knowledge. What happens? When the ego comes, it comes. And when it goes, it goes. It doesn't cause any end in the person. It doesn't cause any problem to the person. It doesn't make him a samsari. Because the person knows the ego is not real. Therefore, the ego has no power anymore. But you are no longer the ego because ignorance about the Atma has already been destroyed. It is destroyed means it is destroyed. Again, it cannot come back. The only thing in the world by which the coming back is not there is this jnanam. This jnanam, in fact, with regard to any jnanam, with regard to other jnanam, there may be forgetfulness, but one cannot forget oneself. So, when the ajnana with regard to oneself is removed, it can't come back. It's gone, one is gone forever. Therefore, only na punarjanma, no again coming back, no samsara. Because the Atma, the ignorance which covered the ignorance about the Atma, that is what we say, cover is destroyed, removed. You know that the ego is Atma, whereas Atma is not the ego. Knowing this, you don't get lost in or caught up by the ego and its activities. So, therefore, even though the person does, that ego is enlightened ego. Even though the person does, kartritvam, the doership, the doer cannot have doership. Even though the person doesn't have doership. Doership, because the doership requires ahankara. Ahankara is now varita. It is varita ahankara. Varita ahankara is like the tamed, tamed animal, tamed snake. It no longer bites you. Therefore, you become free. The knowledge of Atma once there is never lost. Because you have no more ignorance about Atma. Ignorance of Atma again cannot come. If destroyed, is destroyed. If the ego comes, Atma cannot be mistaken as ego anymore. Ego is Atma. The Atma doesn't become the ego just because the ego came. Comes and goes. When it comes, it comes, it goes, it goes. Even a jnani has this ego. He has a sense of walking, doing, eating, everything, but it doesn't bind him. Because the ego is a therefore only he does, but doesn't bind him. Because he knows the truth of ego. Therefore, only kartritvam, not that. Therefore, karma cannot bind. Karmani akarmaha yaha pashyati. Just because the perception comes or an inference is made, just because an action is done or result is gained, just because something happens, Atma doesn't become the ego. This is his condition of a jnani. Everything is Atma. Atma eva idam sarvam. And Atma is not any of them. It is said in the 9th chapter, very nicely. Everything is Atma, but Atma is not any of them. Atmaham teshu te mayi, even in the 7th chapter. When any action is done, ego is there. But Atma is free from all action because it is not the ego. Similarly, the means of doing an action or its result is also Atma, whereas Atma is neither the means doing other result. Just an example, the actor and the bigger example. He is here, but he is not B. This truth being known, person sees actionlessness in action. Karmani akarma darshanam. Karma, the jiva, not a jiva, a jnani jiva does, because ahankara not the ego not there. Therefore, doership not there. Therefore, akarma. Therefore, akarma only. Or atma doesn't do karma, therefore akarma darshanam. Atma darshanam. Karma darshanam is atma darshanam. Therefore, only atma. Atma alone is. Karmani akarma darshanam. Karmani ahankare. Atma darshanam. Ahankara is atma, but atma is not the ahankara. So seeing the truth of ego as atma, that is the darshanam vision person has. Knowledge is the only way to destroy in terms of what atma. Agama alone. Agama meaning shastra, scriptures. Knowledge in the form of words alone, Shabda Pramana, destroys the ego because you are not really building a Pramana here. Rather, you are exposing yourself to the Pramana. You are not operating the Pramana like Pratyaksha Anumana, but what happens? You are exposing yourself to the Pramana. You are exposing yourself to the words. The words fall upon your ears. You listen. Knowledge takes place. So exposing yourself to the Pramana. In fact, you are so exposed that you get shot by the spear of Brahma, called Brahmastra. That's called Brahmastra. The Ramayana, Rama used a Brahmastra to kill Ravana. Astra means a weapon. Astra means that which is thrown. It's called Astra. Astra is which is leaves your hand, and Shastra is that which you hold in your hand and fight, like the knife, sword, etc. That which is remains in your hand. So Astra is the missiles, the arrows. The various forms of practice, such as prayers, rituals, and so on, are called Shastra. Whereas the statement Tattvamasi is called Astra. When this statement is short and the statement is in the Shastra, when it comes from the mouth of a teacher, it is intended to hit you. In fact, the statement comes out like a bullet and it exposes the ego, causing it to die. Ego dies. Dying is the reality due to the ego dies. When the ego gets exposed to the teaching, Tattva-Tomasi, it naturally dies, just as many a demon Ravana did when he was shot by Brahmastra. In fact, that is what Ramayana is about. Symbolically presents. Rama, he kills Ravana. Ravana, the ego. Ravana is attended, the ego and its manifestations. And the arrow stands for the teaching. It destroys the ego, and the person becomes enlightened, muktaha. Tattva-Tomasi is a Brahmastra, and which is released by the teacher and destroys the ego called Ravana once and for all. Rama tried various methods to destroy his enemy Ravana, but nothing happened. He would remove one head, but by the time he destroyed the second, the first head first one came back again. So like that, all he had 10 heads. He could not destroy the 10 head in one shot. One head is removed and is replaced by another head. So this is ego. Ego cannot be removed by any other means. Only means is Shastra, that Brahmastra. It is Brahmastra, the teaching of the Shastra. Tattva-Tomasi, that is a Brahmastra. So this is like trying to remove all our desires. Therefore, Ramayana is also, you can say, even though it is historical fact, can interpret as symbolically also. Ravana, that stands for ego, and Astra, the Brahmastra, stands for the teaching. When the Guru releases the arrow, the ego of the disciple is destroyed. So, there's no other way of destroying this ego. So this is like trying to remove all our desires. One desire is removed, another desire will come. So replaced by another desire. It goes on and on and on. So the only way to remove the desire is to cut at the root. That is only by knowledge. Just when we think one is gone, we find that another one has popped up in space. Finally, Rama was told to use the Brahmastra. Only then did Ravana die. Only then did Ravana get back his joy, Sita, that is moksha, ananda. So, get back his joy, Sita. When the weapon Tattvatamasi is used against the exposed ego, it is destroyed. Thus, you need not do anything except expose yourself to the teaching. This difference between implying perception and inference and exposing yourself to the teaching is what distinguishes this particular means of knowledge from all others, Shastra Pramana. Exposing oneself to the teaching is lending oneself to an entirely different type of Pramana operation. It comes from outside, it is with the Sampradaya, it is with the teacher, and destroys the ego by saying that you are Brahma. For this, no action is performed. You just expose yourself to the Pramana with the Shraddha, the faith, the pending understanding that the Pramana will give you Jnanam, Atma Jnanam. We'll stop here. Still continues. It's not over. Knowledge and error cannot coexist. Jnanam and Ajnanam will read in the next class. Om Purnamadav Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadhaya Purnamevavashishyate Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Harihi Om Dhanyavadaha